Hi, I'm Professor Toby C. from Drexel University. I teach sound recording and music production, and as profession prior to this, I was a recording engineer and now research music production practices, specifically engineering practices.
Hi, I'm Dr. Dan Pratt. I'm the course leader for performance and recording at the University of West London. And prior to that, I was an engineer for indie bands in Australia.
Hi, I'm Dr. Lachlan Gould. I am a lecturer at the University of the Sunshine Coast. And in a previous life, I still am a practicing.
Yeah, why are we saying was? Hang on a second.
I still am a
We all
practicing
are.
music producer and engineer in Australia, where I've won a few awards and produced a few platinum records and all that kind of stuff. Back before my hair was grey. Well, it's not that grey, I guess.
This project examines the mediative practices of recording engineers. In doing so, 3 days of recording sessions were performed in June of 2019 at three institutions, JMC Academy, Queensland University of Technology, and Brisbane Boys College, all in Brisbane, Australia. At each of these sessions, two engineers, one familiar with the studio and one who was not, recorded the same ensemble within a 4 hour time limited session. I was the unfamiliar engineer at each of the sessions, and the 4 hour time limit was based on the Nashville Musicians Union session definition. Each session was observed, recorded, and analyzed, and we will talk about that in the methodology.
We're investigating how engineers operate in unfamiliar situations, and we are comparing it to engineers in slightly more familiar situations. But we're examining this using a construct of time, space, and then the creative reflexivity with which an engineer works in a studio. We're also framing this as the engineer operating the studio as an instrument, rather than thinking of the engineer as just a simple person who walks in and presses buttons.
Okay, so for the rest of this presentation, we're going to quickly run over some literature. We're going to look at the interactivity of place, the reflexivity of facilities, and the interactivity of time and creativity. We're using a qualitative methodology, so we won't sort of really break down the methodology too much at this stage. And after that, we're then going to run into a bit of an analysis. That was a tongue twister. An analysis of some of the videos that we took during the recordings and some of the findings that we had throughout the process.
So, for the literature on the section of interactivity of place, this project makes a clear distinction between engineers and producers. The focus of this project was to examine engineering practice and how engineers mediate all elements of the studio, the acoustic environment, available equipment, etc., as if it were a holistic instrument. So, this project will refer to this instrument as place. Susan Schmidt Horning in 2012 described how changing technology and the need to control acoustics presented engineers with the need to mediate the studio environment, which led to the concept of studio as instrument. Mark Katz in 2012 as well defines the criteria of what makes a musical instrument, and these criteria can be used to argue for studio as instrument due to its ability to manipulate sound through techniques developed for making music. Adam Patrick Bell in 2017 provides support for the conceptualization of the studio as instrument if players are identified by the role they play in music production rather than by their instrument. So that places the engineer as part of the music creation system. So this project uses the framework of actor network theory, which asserts that anyone or anything that acts can provide meaning through the relationships within the network. Rebecca Sheehan takes note that actor network theory does not presuppose power relations, and actors are simultaneously situated in multiple networks. So these conditions allow actor network theory to be used, quote, avenue for cogent reflexivity. So taking that, applying reflexivity actor network theory, I took this and developed a diagram that allows us to kind of map the elements within a sound recording. So this project examines individual relationships at a micro level within a distributed network. Exploring the interactivity of place focuses on the relationships between the content mediators, that being the engineers, and the incidental and the acquired content.
When discussing the nature of humans and facilities, it is important to consider that the engineer and the environment form a codependent partnership. As such, there's an interactivity that occurs between the skills of an engineer and the affordances of the facility within which they interact. Malfoy, in 2008, explains this as a phenomenological reciprocity between the artist and the artifact that is being created. As previously stated in Toby's section, the space, the studio, and the material elements, consoles, microphones, and computers, combine in different facilities to create a unique instrument that is played by the engineer in a co-constructed expression of agency by human and non-human actors, according to Latour and Dant. This relationship between instrument and instrumentalist is a crucial ingredient to the creation of music. When considering the studio as a reflexive musical instrument, we are considering the architectural construction of the environment, the layout of the equipment, the acoustic properties of the space. Such elements combine to create a vital tactile information necessary for a number of crucial decisions that occur in both micro and macro level. These tactile forms of sensory information generate a feedback loop with the engineer that interacts with their decisions while they capture performances using the studio as an instrument. A recording engineer is hired on their ability to assess, analyze, and evaluate certain aspects of production, according to Lefford in 2015. In the case of this investigation, there were two main factors that needed analysing. First, they must manage the tools and space to capture the appropriate elements needed for the recording. Each engineer will take different approaches to spaces, interacting differently within environmental boundaries. Fike, in 1995, argues that creating boundaries around conceptual thinking allows for the bracketing of decision-making. The more boundaries are defined, the easier it is to interact within the set boundaries. The boundaries set by recording engineers are an assessment of the facility's capabilities as well as a reflection on their past recording processes. In the case of a recording environment, the walls of the studio are set by an interaction of an engineer's knowledge, the physical limitations of the space. This relationship of the physical and intellectual sets up a reflexivity between the tacit understanding of the engineer and the limitations of the space. The assessment discussed so far does not consider the inanimate objects to have agency in the production of music. Rather, it takes Bates' view in 2012 that the environment and the equipment has an effect on how the engineer approaches the recording. As such, the environment and decisions cannot be untangled, and the level of familiarity with space improves the engineer's ability to operate in the space. The second factor in the recording process that must be addressed is how engineers interact with the acoustic information coming from the speaker. The relationship between the engineer's auditory processing and their physical actions are a manifestation of how they make decisions within a space. As with the logistical management of equipment in space, the acoustical interpretation of how things interact become the key to how engineers sculpt sound into a finished recording.
So space and time are conceptually implicated in each other. Tricomchek points out that space may be experienced only in time and time only in space. While links between space and time and creativity are not clear, we do know there are confluent phenomena that cannot be separated. Put simply, when you start discussing time, you're going to start discussing creativity. If you're going to start discussing space, you're going to start looking at time or even creativity. They're all mixed up together. However, there's little research on the relationship between creativity and time. That was proposed by Amable in 2016. In investigating associations between the large format studio and time, Scott in 1999 makes the following observations. Recording studios in the cultural economy are extremely unstable, finely grained, frequent and mediated by face-to-face contact, which means they also tend to absorb significant resources of time and energy. Time is also considered an asset in the studio, often given more significance than the recording spaces or the technology. In the large format studio era of the late 1970s and early 80s, Brian Eno puts it quite simply in this manner. So this is from 1981. Beware the panic effect that accompanies the high cost of studio time. One becomes increasingly oriented towards results and progressively less inclined to engage in experimental activities that might not lead anywhere. As a result of this, one focuses one's attention on the safe bet, on the tried and tested techniques. Watson and other authors in 2009 suggested that studio work is very expensive and often performed under severe time constraints. Recording in the large format studio involves a direct time-money relationship, which in turn impacts upon creativity. Creativity involves being completely absorbed in artistic goals, and our friend Csikszentmihalyi has named this state the flow experience. In his studies on creativity, he notes that respondents were in an optimal experience of flow. Common perceptions of time were altered. Hours pass by in minutes, and minutes can seem to stretch out like hours. He ascribes that effect to the extreme efforts of concentration given to the task at hand, and so time is perceived to elapse more quickly. Coupling that effect with a recording studio space emphasises the precarious relationship of recording space with recording time. A lot of time is needed to record music, and when creativity is copious, one's perception of time will alter. So within this research, by fixing the time allowance, we're examining how an unfamiliar engineer adapts to a newer studio environment within a limited time period. By removing any scope for these traditional forms of creativity that I've been discussing, the engineer must rely on tried and tested factory-style recording techniques, thereby reducing the potential for this sort of flow state of creativity. This infers that the engineer will approach the session using tacit knowledge gained from previous recording experiences, combined with a reflexive response to the affordances of the musicians, the music, their instruments, and the recording studio.
So just a quick reminder of how we set things up. There were 4-hour recording sessions, and what we're about to do is we're going to go through some of the data that we collected during these 4-hour recording sessions. The first one was Lachlan versus Toby in JMC Studios. The second one was Toby versus a young up-and-coming engineer called Duncan Adamson in QUT Studios. And the third one was myself versus Toby in the Brisbane Boys College Studios. Now, just very quickly, 2 of those were mimicking large format studios, and one of those was more of a smaller project studio. So we were trying to explore slightly different environments so that we could have a variety of studios to work with. So the closest to your sort of mega studio would be QUT, followed by JMC, and then way down if you go into the BBC, which is kind of a very esoteric, self-set DIY style studio.
We should also add that one engineer would go in first and conduct their 4-hour session while the other engineer stayed completely out of it. The studio would be stripped back down to nothing, and then the other engineer would come in with the same artist and start again and record them, and then we would listen to the recordings and interview the engineers about their different approaches to these recordings.
During this time, there was an observer who was taking notes. There were filmed sections, so if an interesting section occurred, the observers were all engineers as well. If at any time there was an interesting point happening, we would film and start interviewing and talking about it. And then at the end of each session, we took extensive filming notes of microphone positions, and we took interviews of the 2 producers who were battling it out against each other. Finally, we're going to go over some of the data that we collected. We're going to show you some of the videos from the sessions, and we're going to have a little bit of discussion on each of these videos in relation to place, reflexivity of the engineer, and time. So we can kind of think about the interactivity of the time and the place, or the time and the space, and then how the producer is interacting within that. We're going to freewheel this a little bit because we want to discuss these and react to them as we see them. So the first one is it's Toby talking about how he's going to manage the space.
I changed my mind. Drums in a small space. I mean, it's dead and that fits the track. Mm-hmm. But I'm just concerned about boundaries being that close.
All right, so reactions on that, lads.
Well, my reaction is, here I made a decision, a sonic decision, before I ever heard any sound, just based off the facility we were in. Here was a song that was very pop and very dry, where a deader room might have probably made more sense. But the deader room was so small that I felt like I was just worried about any trashy sounds I would get off of a close boundary. So I decided to just eliminate that before I even heard anything. And so to me, that's the question of does the sonic signature does it actually exist in the engineer and the person internally rather than actually the physical space itself? But it was kind of me playing the place.
So if I take that into here, so as a content mediator and the incidental and acquired so you're thinking about the influence of the domain when you're working on that.
Yeah. So what I'm thinking about is the incidental content here. The actualized content, the drummer's going to play and make sound. But what I'm concerned with is, and I'm going to acquire it. But what I'm worried about is when cymbals hit a surface and bounce back into a mic. How trashy is that going to get if the boundaries are too close? Whereas I still want a dead sound, but I'd rather go with a larger room and deal with my miking situation in order to keep that type of incidental content out of the picture. Therefore, I already have an incidental content in my head going into this.
All right. So this next video is a discussion on using a piece of equipment to develop a sound which feels a little bit like taking previous practice, like if you're an instrumentalist learning a scale or something like that, and then applying that to your practice when you're in a time-pressured environment.
I planned on using that in my head before the session started. I always sort of thought I'd run the piano microphones through the Avalon preamp. I quite like the Avalon preamp. It's valve, but it's a bit sort of hi-fi. And I had 414s on the piano, which are a little bit boring. And just the Avalon makes it a little bit more exciting. Not too much. But we were having issues on the console. I started trying to troubleshoot it and then went, I didn't want to use these preamps anyway, and that's a good thing to test what is making this crackling sound. And lo and behold, it turned out to be the console. So I think number one, I mentioned how I pre-planned it, so that is already showing you that I'm familiar with the place. I've used the studio before, and I'm going to instantly go for those kind of more A-class assets over some of the others. So I'd pre-planned that I wanted to do that. I also knew in that recording I wanted the piano to be the lead instrument, so that was why I was considering that first. I wanted to make sure the piano sounded good. And then there's always the timeliness going into it in that making those decisions beforehand. I know I can jump in straight away and just plug them in, although I seem to have forgotten during the session and tried to get it happening on the console, and yet the console was telling me, hey, I'm crackling, you want to use the Avalons, which is, I love that sort of stuff in the studio.
that sort of quick reaction to how the instrument works.
Yeah, there's that tacit knowledge and the creative reflexivity going on there constantly.
Definitely. So yeah, there's an extent where the console is talking to you and saying these channels ain't going to work, and then in your mind you then start connecting that back to your previous practice, so your scales if you're an instrumentalist, or your technique exercises, and then you're bringing that back to knowledge as well, because I noticed you also said that you're matching what you feel is a fairly boring microphone of the 414 with the slightly more exciting preamp.
It's a great mediocre microphone. But then when you add it in with something nicer, it turns something kind of mediocre into something a little bit sort of more special, which is what I was looking for.
The final video is we're just going to observe Duncan in QUT Studios definitely reacting to the time pressure.
I'm pretty much sticking to like a default sort of configuration for like the drum kit that I usually do. I'm not doing anything outlandish or experimental in terms of use of equipment. So I'm pretty much going for something standard-ish, so to say, so as to be able to do as much as possible.
All right.
Yeah. So you can see he's a bit frantic. And I'm sure that time pressure of that 4-hour session is in the back of his mind constantly. Um, and so therefore he is relying on some tacit knowledge, his familiarity with the room. But he leaves us with a couple of things: a default setting, sticking with something standardish, which to me, that has a meaning in his head, but only in his head. It's standard for him, which I think is rather interesting, which again to me points back to that sonic signature being in the engineer's mind, attached to the place. But anyway, yeah, and then the time pressure just kind of kicks it into high gear.
Yeah, and it's also, I think it's a youth thing as well. From being the observer on quite a few of these sessions, I did notice that both you and Lachlan had less. You appeared to be less driven by the time pressure. You would often just go, oh, well, we've got to abandon that. But you weren't, I think Duncan, as a younger engineer, was a lot more intimidated by the time pressure. And that speaks a little bit to me about the future of engineering, where a lot of younger students that I work with in education practice are used to having all the time in the world. Whereas I think both of you as engineers are quite used to working within, if it doesn't get done by this time, then I'm paying more rent.
You work within the boundaries of what the session dictates. So again, you're always being reflexive to what's going on, and you have to draw upon your tacit knowledge, which I'll always refer to as like an engineer's toolkit. You've got your tricks within the bag that you'll try, and you tacitly know whether, one, it's worked straight away, or whether you quickly need to grab another trick because the first one didn't work.
So just to finish up here, is there anything in particular that's popping out in this that's really getting you thinking a lot more about how we classify engineers, how we think about all that sort of stuff, or how is there any particular point that's poking out at the moment?
I think for me, the most interesting thing that's coming out of this is, like myself, throughout my creative practice, I've been an engineer and a producer most of the time. And I will often think of the engineering role as being quite technical, doing the boring stuff, checking the levels, making sure nothing's distorting when it shouldn't be. And the producer's the crazy man in the back going, hey, let's do this crazy stuff. But I think the more you look at it, when you put these time pressures on things, there's a lot of creativity involved in how you react to things. It's a very reflexive environment, but you're always reacting to what's going on, and you need to make decisions quickly and fast. So there's a lot of tacit knowledge going on there, and they're all the things that I think are really important in engineering practice. So engineering is a lot more creative that I'm discovering through this research.
And I feel like I've always kind of had the mindset that the engineer has more creative control than they get credit for. I've always kind of felt that I can manipulate the performers, and I'll include the producer in that. If the producer is a separate person, I can manipulate the entire system. I don't necessarily need to verbalize that or look like some sort of a leading role. I do that through my performance as an engineer. As the musicians are performing, I react to what I hear. They react to what they hear, but what they hear is what I give them. So I can manipulate performances that way. I've always felt this way. And what I'm finding with this research is it's reinforcing what I've felt as an engineer. It is true that there's much more of a leading role as the engineer, even if they're the silent person in the room.
To me, one of the things that I do with my students is I like to take them through some of the videos of Sylvia Massey doing all these sort of wacky and creative things in the studio, which I always think is just so cool. And but what I'm looking at there is that's actually engineering practice. It's a creative form of engineering, and we often talk about like excellent producers like Massey as a producer, but I wonder that maybe more of her creativity actually comes from being an amazingly creative engineer, and that again, there's that sort of line blurring between what is the producer, what is the engineer.
Yeah, and you're totally hitting the nail on the head. Like when we refer to the studio as an instrument, what Sylvia Massey is doing there is she's manipulating place, which is the instrument. Yeah, it is. We're totally blurring the lines here between what's engineering and what's production, and really, does there need to be that delineation anymore?
Well, actually, I think maybe we'll leave it at that.
Yeah.
Let's call that our conclusion, and then nice to see you all. I'm in the UK. Toby's in. Are you in Philly at the moment, or are you still in
California?
You're still in California. Oh, it sounds tough. And Lachlan's in Australia, and
Where it's 21 degrees and it's winter.
so actually, I'm in London where it's 21 degrees and it's summer. Awesome. See you all later.
See ya.
Bye.